Hey everyone, it's Sevi. Rosaria has been around since the early versions of Genshin Impact, and in my opinion, she hasn't lost relevance since then. As a very strong yet versatile 4-star unit, I find her to be worth building for various types of reaction teams. So to help you learn how to build this badass sister, I'm bringing you my full updated guide on her, which includes her new Dendro synergies. As usual, I'll cover her kit, gameplay tips, constellations, artifacts and weapon builds, and her team comps. Let's get straight into it.
You have a job for me? I've got time.
Starting with Rosaria's talents and gameplay mechanics. Rosaria's normal attacks are a 5-hit combo that deal physical damage, but these are only ever relevant if you plan on playing Rosaria as an on-field physical damage dealer or as a cryo on-fielder with Chongyun. However, I wouldn't recommend these playstyles since her best and way more optimal usage comes from her cryo skill and burst abilities. Hence, I won't be covering her on-field playstyle in this guide anymore, and you can just generally ignore her auto attack mechanics and talent level. Moving on, Rosaria's skill targets an enemy that allows her to blink to them and deal 2 hits of cryo damage. The 2 cryo hits have no ICD, so they can both apply cryo and proc reactions if possible. Furthermore, her skill is an added form of mobility that quickly closes the gap between her and opponents. This is especially helpful in conserving stamina to chase enemies. On small enough enemies, using her skill will allow her to blink behind the opponent, but on certain large enemies or those with shields, she cannot. The advantage of using your skill to backstab enemies is from her A1 passive. When Rosaria uses her skill to strike an opponent from behind, she increases her own crit rate by 12% for 5 seconds. If she's unable to automatically blink behind, you'll either have to manually position her, which might take a bit more effort, or just settle with not getting the bonus crit rate. Rosaria's skill also generates 3 cryo particles as long as the second hit connects with the enemy. If it doesn't, then no particles are generated. She mostly needs those particles to battery herself so she can burst reliably, or she can also be used to funnel particles to another teammate. And thanks to her skill's short 6-second cooldown, it's very possible to use her skill more than once in a rotation. Now onto the most important part of Rosaria's kit, her burst. Upon casting, she deals cryo damage twice, then plants an ice lance that will deal cryo damage every 2 seconds in an AoE. This is off-field cryo application and damage over time, which means she requires very little field time to contribute damage and help set up cryo-related reactions like freeze or superconduct. More importantly, her burst ticks also have no ICD, meaning each will apply cryo onto enemies. This is especially useful for freeze and reverse melt playstyles since the constant cryo application ensures high freeze uptime and you can make each tick trigger a melt reaction respectively. This also makes her a pretty good shield breaker against hydro or electro shields. It also snapshots, so it will maintain any buffs Rosaria had upon casting her burst, even if those buffs expire over its duration. So set up any relevant buffs before using her burst. It costs 60 energy with a 15-second cooldown, which means she can fit into shorter or longer rotations. Either way, it's very important that she has enough ER to burst every rotation in whatever team she's in. Placing her burst might need some positioning awareness, as it confines you to its radius, more so if it's combined with other fixed abilities like Bennett's Circle. There are also some times where it doesn't target the area you want. So if you need to move Rosaria first to ensure that her burst will land in the best place, then it might be worth doing so. Her burst also has another significant support utility that comes from her A4 passive. When Rosaria casts her burst, her teammates' crit rates are increased by 15% of Rosaria's own crit rate for 10 seconds. Note that this will only be based on the crit rate and buffs that reflect on her stat page. Effects like the Blizzard Strayer or damage type specific buffs like the Catch's added burst crit rate do not show up on the stat page, therefore they do not contribute towards her passive's calculation. With that, combining her A1 and A4 passives is the key to ensuring maximum crit rate sharing. Backstab enemies with her skill if you can to get the 12% crit rate buff, then use her burst to buff her teammates and also to snapshot her crit rate stat. As a nice bonus in the open world, Rosaria's exploration passive increases your party's movement speed by 10% during the nighttime. Then for talent priorities, level up her burst first as it composes the bulk of her damage, then you can follow it up with her skill. Leave her auto attacks alone unless you really plan on using her as an on-field damage dealer. Moving on, Rosaria's Constellations buff various parts of her kit, though there are specific ones that are highly valuable. Let's see what they add. C1 buffs her attack speed and normal attack damage. This constellation is only relevant if playing Rosaria on field, and even then it's just a very small damage increase. This is her least useful constellation. C2 extends her burst uptime by 4 seconds, allowing 2 more burst ticks. Since her burst is the most important part of her kit for damage and cryo application, this is definitely her most valuable constellation, which is also fairly accessible as the second one. C3 increases her skill level by 3, C4 regenerates 5 flat energy for Rosaria when her skill does a crit hit. Take note that even if both hits of her skill crit, the energy regeneration will only occur once. The energy regenerated is also not affected by her ER stat. It can situationally allow you to use less ER substats and go for more offensive stats, but as Rosaria is a burst-dependent character, I wouldn't scrimp on her ER requirements. You can mostly view this as a quality of life constellation for her energy. C5 increases her burst level by 3, again another good boost to her most important ability. And C6 reduces enemies' physical resistance when hit by her burst. This makes Rosaria more valuable in physical damage teams, but of course the effect is not relevant in a reaction-based team. In general, Rosaria's C2 and C5 are her most significant constellations since they greatly buff her burst, while C4 is a welcome energy improvement. Now we can discuss how to build Rosaria. In general, her build will revolve around maximizing her burst damage, then her artifact stats and sets can vary depending on what team you're playing her in. We'll start with her artifact stats. The simplest is her Goblet, which should be cryo damage bonus. Then her Sands and Circlet will depend on her team. On her Freeze or General Burst DPS playstyles, an Attack Sands is the best. This can be swapped with an ER Sands only if the team she's in forces her to need high ER. But on a Reverse Melt playstyle, an EM Sands is preferred while Attack Sands is a lower priority option. Since Rosaria can melt on each burst tick, she can take full advantage of the added EM. However, a good Attack Sands can still suffice, especially if Rosaria is receiving EM buffs from teammates or if she's using a weapon with high EM. Then for her Circlet, it depends again on her role and stats. Rosaria will mainly want a crit rate main stat for her Reverse Melt, Superconduct, or general off-field role. Even if her crit rate goes past the typical 1:2 ratio, her teammates will still appreciate the extra crit rate that gets shared to them. Just be mindful if her crit rate will go past 100% after adding all the relevant buffs. However, if Rosaria is on a freeze team using a Blizzard Strayer set, both of which give a lot of crit rate, then you'll want to aim for a crit damage circlet instead. Buffing Rosaria's crit rate share is not as important in a freeze team since the main cryo DPS will typically also be carrying a Blizzard Strayer set already. However, if Rosaria is on a freeze team and not on a Blizzard Strayer set, she may opt for either a crit rate or damage circlet. For Rosaria's artifact substats, make sure to get the ER she needs, then look for crit substats, attack percent, and EM if she's on a Reverse Melt build. It's crucial to fulfill her energy recharge since her burst uptime is very important. Her ER stat can largely vary depending on several factors like her team comp, the rotation you're using, the enemies you're up against, if you're using a Favonius weapon, etc. With a cryo teammate, it can vary from 130 to 170%. Without a cryo teammate, her ER requirements can go higher, up to 160 to 200%, since she only has herself to rely on with generating cryo particles. Then when it comes to artifact sets, Rosaria has several viable options. 4-piece Noblesse is a great generalist support set that offers a balance between boosting Rosaria's personal damage and supporting her teammates thanks to its 2-piece and 4-piece effects. It's also strong boxable, and its 2-piece set can be combined with other 2-piece sets, making it quite flexible to break down. If no one else in the team is using the Noblesse set and your teammates are attack scaling, it's possible that equipping a Noblesse build can lead to overall higher team damage. Just note that it's not going to let you attain the highest personal damage ceiling for Rosaria herself, and if someone else in the team is already using it, the 4-piece effect becomes redundant as it doesn't stack. The 4-piece emblem set is another generalist burst-focused option that helps address her ER needs and buff her burst damage. Not to mention, it's in a resin-efficient domain. If Rosaria is in a team where she has higher ER requirements, then the ER bonus of this is more valuable. However, this set is very in demand for many other burst DPSs, so you may prioritize them while Rosaria uses other options. The 4-piece Blizzard Strayer set is an undisputed best in slot for Rosaria only in a freeze team to achieve her highest damage potential. Thanks to its crit rate buff, the set lets her focus on stacking more crit damage instead. Just note that the crit bonus of the 4-piece is not counted towards her crit sharing passive. The 4-piece Gilded Dreams and Lava Walker sets can offer high damage potential strictly in a reverse melt team. The Gilded Dreams EM and attack buffs and the Lava Walker's damage bonus on pyro-affected enemies both synergize with Rosaria's melt playstyle. However, these aren't as efficient to farm just for Rosaria. Aside from being very niche sets, many other characters would appreciate the full Gilded set more. The Lava Walker set also isn't worth strongboxing and thus should only be acquired when farming in the Crimson Witch artifact domain. Basically, they can be a recommended option for her reverse melt build only if you have a really good set to spare. One very niche build is the Instructor set, which can be used to make Rosaria support other reaction-based DPSs like In a Bloom, Hyper Bloom, or Forward Melt team. However, due to its 4-star limitation, the Instructor set has a lower stat ceiling, leading to lower damage for Rosaria herself. So if you want an Instructor set buff, consider equipping it on another teammate. And finally, you can opt for a 2-piece combo of Blizzard Strayer, Noblesse, attack sets, and emblem to combine pieces with really good substats. A 2-piece EM set can also be considered for a melt build. When it comes to her weapon options, Rosaria has so many choices. Some of them are generally good recommendations for whichever team she's in, while others have situational or niche uses. It would be tedious to go through them one by one, especially since many of the weapons have overlapping functions. So to keep it digestible, I will give general and specific pointers for weapon choices, and also link calculations from the KQM team as a guideline on how specific weapons rank in specific playstyles. First of all, crit weapons are usually highly recommended on Rosaria to boost her overall damage. Just be mindful if you're at risk of overcapping her crit rate if it's a crit rate weapon. On top of adding crit rate to herself, it's very possible to exceed 100% if she's on a Blizzard Strayer and Freeze team, but weapons that also give attack or relevant damage bonus buffs can be very valuable as well. One generally outstanding 4-star weapon is the Wavebreaker's Fin, which gives a high attack stat and high burst damage buff. It's very good whether you use Rosaria in a freeze or melt team, or just as an all-around off-field burst DPS. However, it is a limited banner weapon, so it can be hard to get. And while this is one of the top picks, there are still many other 4-star weapons that can be more accessible and still be great, so don't feel pressured to pull for this. Then there are specific weapons that are only useful if she's built for a reverse melt playstyle. The Staff of Scarlet Sands is her best premium choice for reverse melt because of its high crit rate and passive buff. The Dragon's Bane gives her a lot of EM and a damage bonus buff on enemies affected by Pyro, which are perfect for her reverse melt teams. There are also 2 free-to-play options for this playstyle. The Kitane Cross Spear for its EM and energy refunding mechanic, and Missive Wind Spear for its attack and EM buffs. But again, outside of melt teams, these weapons aren't recommended picks for Rosaria. ER weapons can also be very valuable for addressing her ER needs. For instance, the Catch is a very solid generalist free-to-play weapon for Rosaria since it gives 3 important stats: ER, burst damage, and burst crit rate. Unfortunately, this weapon is more sought after by either Xiangling or Raiden Shogun, thus making it likely you'll prioritize it on them. An alternative is the 5-star Skyward Spine if you manage to snag one, which is pretty close to the Catch in terms of power level. The Favonius Lance is also a good ER option if Rosaria and her teammates need more help with their energy generation. Its condition, which requires your character to crit, also synergizes with Rosaria. It won't yield the highest damage numbers on her, but ensuring that your other DPS teammates have consistent burst uptime, like Ayaka or Ganyu in a freeze team, can be very beneficial for your overall team DPS. However, if your team's energy generation can be sufficient even without a Favonius user, or if someone else is already holding a Fav weapon, you can instead opt for a more damage-focused weapon on Rosaria. Finally, let's take a look at Rosaria's best team templates. The first is a freeze team, which is made up of 2 cryo units, 1 hydro, and 1 flex slot. Rosaria has many options for cryo partners, which I'll flash on screen. The hydro slot is quite flexible as you are mainly looking for their hydro application anyway. The main consideration is if your hydro unit will assume more of an on-field or off-field role, and if they can also consolidate multiple roles like how Kokomi combines hydro application and healing. For the flex slot, you typically want an Animo VV holder that can shred cryo resistance and ideally group enemies. If you have Kazuha, he can give a further huge boost to your team damage thanks to his elemental damage bonus buff. But if the last slot isn't an Animo unit, then you can just opt for another Cryo or Hydro or even Zhongli. With Dendro reactions, capitalizing on Rosaria's freeze-enabling capabilities makes her an excellent option for the flex slot of a Bloom, Hyper Bloom, or Burgeon team. The gist of it is that Cryo does not interrupt with these teams' reaction process, and can even enhance the generation of Dendro cores. Rosaria then gives such teams helpful crowd-controlling utility while also being another source of damage. Next is Reverse Melt teams. To clarify, Reverse Melt is when you apply Cryo on Pyro to trigger Melt, whereas Forward Melt is Pyro on Cryo. Reverse Melts technically have a lower damage multiplier of times 1.5 compared to Forward Melt, which is times 2. But Reverse Melt has the advantage of usually not immediately consuming the Pyro aura, which can let you more reliably trigger consecutive melts, whereas Forward Melts immediately consume the Cryo aura, making it trickier to set up consecutive melt reactions. The most straightforward Reverse Melt template uses Rosaria with Bennett, Xiangling, and a flex slot. The flex slot is usually another Cryo like Kaya or Chongyun to be another DPS, though Anemo units like Sucrose or Kazuha can also work, or even Zhongli as a comfort pick. In this comp, Xiangling continuously applies Pyro for Rosaria and potentially another Cryo unit to trigger melts on, while Bennett buffs attack and heals. Another iteration of this is the Sunfire Reverse Melt team. The Sunfire comp is a combination of Jean's and Bennett's bursts, which has a special interaction that lets you continuously apply Pyro on enemies within range. A more recent version of Reverse Melt is Burn Melt, which utilizes Burning's persistent Pyro application to continuously set up melt reactions. However, this is only feasible with Nahida, who can re-trigger Burning thanks to her skill mechanics. It's also tricky and requires more timing and rotational awareness. On the other hand, there are forward melt comps where Pyro will be the one triggering the melt reaction. Due to the relatively more difficult setup of this team, it's a bit more niche. You will need a lot more Cryo application, as Rosaria alone might not be sufficient enough to consistently set up forward melts. This can be achieved by putting in another Cryo unit or having an Anemo unit infuse their ability with Cryo. You also have to be more deliberate with your Pyro application timing, since incorrect timing might turn this into an inconsistent mix of forward and reverse melts. There's also another niche melt option, which is combining a good Hydra applicator with Rosaria's Cryo application. The effect is that they will freeze the enemy, which in turn your Pyro DPS can trigger forward melts on. Finally, Rosaria can be used as a support for physical teams or carries, since she can enable Superconduct with her Cryo application while also acting as an off-field damage dealer. Even better if you have C6, which reduces physical resistance. For Eula teams in particular, Rosaria is an excellent option for batterying Eula while contributing damage. Do note though that Rosaria's crit rate buff might not last long enough to finish Eula's burst unless you prematurely end it. All in all, we can see that Rosaria has an amazing combination of off-field damage dealing capabilities, Cryo application, and a crit rate support buff that make her a valuable and formidable team member, even if she often insists on working alone. This makes Rosaria a worthwhile investment to build in my book, and a staple recommendation for future teams that need Cryo application and damage. Let me know in the comments who you like to comp Rosaria with, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!
I'm no stranger to spilling blood, but never have I possessed such power before. For such blessings, I give you thanks.